There are moments in life when the world feels like it's in chaos, when everything seems out of control and the weight of despair hangs heavy over us. But there is a truth, a divine reality, that we must always remember. God is about to step in, and nobody can stop it. You see, when the world shouts that it's too late, when the enemy whispers that there's no hope, that's when God is preparing his intervention. He is never late, never early. He is always right on time. His plans are bigger than our problems, stronger than our weaknesses, and more powerful than any obstacle standing in our way. And when he moves, when he steps into the picture, there is nothing and no one who can hinder his purpose. Not the naysayers, not the cynics, not the skeptics. When God decides it's time, it's time. The enemy may try to hinder the work of God. He may try to build walls, put up barriers, and cause confusion. But what the enemy forgets is that God specializes in breaking down walls, in turning confusion into clarity, in making a way where there seems to be no way. When God steps in, those walls crumble, those chains that have held us for years. This isn't just about a personal victory. It's about the shifting of a nation, the rising of a people. God is not just about individual restoration. He's about collective revival. When he steps in, it affects everyone. Generational curses are broken, families are restored, cities are healed, and nations are transformed. He doesn't do things halfway. When God moves, he does so completely and with purpose. No one can stop it. When God moves in a person's life, he does it in such a way that no man, no government, no power, no force can hold back what he has planned. No matter the resistance, no matter the opposition, God's will always prevail. His timing, his power, his wisdom, nothing compares to it. All the kings and rulers, all the powers and authorities of the earth are like dust in his hand. But let me tell you something. This isn't a passive waiting. We must prepare ourselves for God's move. We must be in position. We must remain faithful, knowing that even when things seem silent, God is working behind the scenes. His angels are dispatched. His plans are being orchestrated. Our role is to hold fast, to trust in his goodness, and to declare that we believe he is about to do something powerful. The season of waiting is almost over. The season of uncertainty, the season of trial, the season of struggle, it is about to come to an end. And just when you thought you couldn't take another step, just when you thought the storm was too fierce, that's when God will rise. And when he steps in, it's not just to change your circumstances, it's to change you. He will lift you to heights you never thought possible. So stand firm, stand tall, and know this: no one can stop what God is about to do. The heavens are about to open, and the earth will shake. The promises you've been waiting for will be fulfilled. When God steps in, no one, no power, no force, no situation can stop what he's about to unleash in your life. There is a divine order to time, a rhythm that belongs to God alone. When he moves with precision, not a second too early and not a moment too late. It may seem like delays or setbacks, but they are often setups for something greater. We live in a world that operates on human schedules, deadlines, and expectations, but God is not bound by our timetables. His ways are higher, his thoughts are greater, and his understanding is beyond our comprehension. When we feel like nothing is happening, when we grow impatient, we must remember that God is never late. His timing is perfect. Look through history and you will see it. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea, Pharaoh's army closing in behind them, they thought it was over. There was no way forward, no escape route, no time left. But God was not late. At the very last moment, when all hope seemed lost, he split the sea in two. The waters parted, the path was made, and his people walked through on dry ground. Had they arrived at that spot a day earlier, they would have stood in confusion, seeing no way through. Had they arrived later, Pharaoh's army would have overtaken them. But God's timing was precise. He knew exactly when to move. Look at Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a son, but the years passed and still no child. Doubt crept in, human reasoning took over, and they tried to make the promise happen on their own. But God's plan was already in motion. He wasn't late, he was preparing something greater. And when the time was right, when it was impossible by human standards, Sarah conceived and gave birth to Isaac, a child born not of man's effort, but of God's perfect timing. When Jesus walked the earth, he never rushed, he never hurried, he moved with divine precision. When Lazarus fell sick, his sister sent word to Jesus, begging him to come. But he waited, he delayed. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. The mourners had given up, they had accepted that the story was over. But God was not late. Jesus stood before the tomb, called Lazarus out, and what was once dead came back to life. If he had come earlier, he would have healed a sick man, but by waiting, he raised a dead man. The miracle was even greater because it happened at the appointed time. There is a lesson in this for all of us. We live in a world that demands instant results. We grow frustrated when things don't happen according to our plans. We question God, wondering why he hasn't stepped in yet. But the truth is, God sees the full picture. What looks like a delay to us is a divine setup. What feels like silence is actually preparation. He is arranging circumstances, aligning events, and making sure that everything falls into place so that when he steps in, nothing can stop what he is about to do. Consider a seed planted in the ground. You water it, you wait, but for a long time you see nothing. Days, weeks, months pass, and still the ground looks the same. But beneath the surface, something is happening. Roots are growing deep. The foundation is being set. And at the right time, when the process is complete, the seed breaks through the soil and becomes what it was meant to be. If you dig it up too soon, you destroy the process. If you grow impatient and give up, you miss the harvest. God's timing works the same way. There is no situation too far gone, no dream too delayed, no promise too impossible for God. He is never late. He is working even when you cannot see it. And when the appointed time comes, nothing and no one will be able to stop what he has planned. When God moves, no force in heaven, on earth, or under the earth can stand against him. His power is absolute, his authority unquestionable, and his will unstoppable. No matter how great the obstacle, how fierce the opposition, or how impossible the situation may seem, when God decides to act, nothing can hinder his plans. The world may try to resist him, enemies may rise against his purposes, and circumstances may look insurmountable, but God's power overrides them all. Think about the greatest empires in history, the mightiest rulers, the strongest armies, the most powerful nations. They rose in their strength, boasting of their dominance, believing that nothing could challenge their rule. But where are they now? The kingdoms of Egypt, Babylon, Rome. Once they seemed invincible, yet they fell. Why? Because human power is limited, but God's power is eternal. When Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go, he thought his rule was above God's command. He hardened his heart, resisted God's word, and stood in defiance. But could he stop what God had ordained? No. Plague after plague, sign after sign, God demonstrated his power. And when Pharaoh still refused, God parted the Red Sea for his people and drowned the enemy behind them. No amount of military strength, no degree of political authority, no earthly force could stop what God had purposed. The enemy always tries to resist the work of God. Throughout history, he has raised up adversaries, stirred up fear, and sown doubt to try to derail what God is doing. But every time, God proves that his will prevails. Look at the story of Daniel. The rulers of Babylon made a decree that no one could pray to any god except the king. It was a direct challenge to God's authority. Daniel remained faithful, and for his obedience he was thrown into the lion's den. By all human reasoning, his fate was sealed. The lions should have devoured him, but when God is involved, natural laws are overruled. He shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel emerged unharmed. The enemy had a plan, but God had a greater one. Consider the life of Jesus himself. The religious leaders plotted against him. The Roman authorities sentenced him to death, and the soldiers nailed him to a cross. The enemy thought he had won. Darkness covered the land, and for 3 days it seemed like God's plan had been defeated. But could death stop the power of God? Could a sealed tomb hold back the King of Kings? No. On the 3rd day, the stone was rolled away, and Jesus rose in victory. The grave could not hold him, and the enemy could not stop him. The same is true today. You may be facing a situation where everything seems to be working against you. People may be trying to block your path. Circumstances may appear impossible, and the enemy may be whispering that there's no way out. But when God steps in, everything changes. Chains that seemed unbreakable suddenly fall apart. Doors that were locked for years swing wide open. When God decides to bless you, no one can curse you. When he chooses to promote you, no one can hold you back. When he declares victory over your life, no enemy can overturn it. People may try to delay what God is doing. They may slander you, oppose you, or even attempt to harm you, but they are not in control. God is. And what he has decreed over your life will come to pass. The key is to trust in his power, to stand firm in faith, knowing that no matter how strong the resistance, God is stronger. No matter how dark the night, his light will break through. When God speaks, his word does not return void. When he moves, no force in the universe can stop him. The battle is not yours, it is his. And when he fights, he never loses. When God moves, he does not just touch one life. He ignites transformation on a grand scale. His plans are not limited to a single person or a single moment. When he steps in, families are restored, generations are redeemed, and entire nations feel the impact. He is not a small God with small plans. His vision stretches beyond what we can see, and his power extends beyond what we can comprehend. Throughout history, we see that God's interventions have never been about one person alone. When he called Abraham, it wasn't just about giving him a son. It was about birthing a nation. When he raised up Moses, it wasn't just to rescue one man, it was to deliver an entire people. When he anointed David, it wasn't just to bless a shepherd, it was to establish a kingdom that would ultimately lead to the Messiah. God thinks generationally, eternally, and his movements have ripple effects that continue long after the moment has passed. Look at the Israelites in Egypt. They had been enslaved for 400 years, crying out for deliverance. It wasn't just about one person suffering. It was about an entire people needing freedom. When God moved, he didn't just rescue a few. He brought an entire nation out of bondage. And he didn't just lead them into an empty land. He had a promised land prepared for them, a place where their descendants would flourish. His plan was never just about their present struggle. It was about their future generations. When Jesus walked the earth, his miracles weren't just for individuals. Every time he healed someone, every time he restored sight, raised the dead, or cast out demons, it wasn't just about the person standing in front of him. It was a sign, a message, a revelation of God's greater plan for humanity. When he fed the 5,000, it wasn't just about satisfying hunger. It was about showing that he is the bread of life. When he calmed the storm, it wasn't just about stopping the wind and waves. It was about demonstrating his authority over all creation. His work always pointed to something bigger. Even in our time, when God steps in, the impact goes beyond what we expect. A single transformed life can lead to an entire family being saved. One restored marriage can set a new foundation for generations to come. One person delivered from addiction can change the course of a whole lineage. The work God does in you is not just for you, it's for those who come after you. Think about revival throughout history. When God moved, entire cities and nations were transformed. The Great Awakenings were not just about a few individuals having an encounter with God. They shifted the spiritual climate of nations. The Welsh revival was not just about one preacher. It spread across an entire country, and its effects were felt around the world. This is why we must not limit our faith to only personal breakthroughs. Yes, God wants to heal you, bless you, and restore you, but His plan for you is connected to something greater. What He does in your life is part of a bigger picture. Your story is connected to the stories of those around you. Your deliverance is meant to inspire someone else's faith. Your breakthrough is meant to encourage another generation. We must start seeing God's movements through the lens of eternity. When He steps in, He shifts destinies, reclaims what was lost, and restores what was broken. Not just for individuals, but for entire families, communities, and nations. When He moves, it is never small. It is always bigger, always greater, and always beyond what we could imagine. When God moves, no human authority, no government, no institution, and no earthly power can stand in His way. His authority is absolute, His dominion is unchallenged, and His sovereignty is beyond human comprehension. Kings may rise and fall, rulers may scheme and plot, nations may make their plans, but all of it is dust in His hands. No decree, no law, no political force can overturn what God has ordained. When He speaks, His word stands forever. And when He acts, no power can stop Him. History is filled with examples of leaders who thought they could control the course of events, only to find themselves powerless against the hand of God. Pharaoh believed he had authority over Israel, refusing to let them go. He relied on his status, his armies, and his wealth, thinking that he was untouchable. But when God intervened, Pharaoh's kingdom was shaken to its core. The plagues came, one after another, demonstrating that no matter how powerful a king may seem, he is no match for the Almighty. And when Pharaoh finally let the Israelites go, he still tried to reclaim control, pursuing them to the Red Sea. Yet in one decisive moment, God wiped out the mightiest army of its time. No ruler, no government, no military force could resist him. Centuries later, King Nebuchadnezzar ruled over the great Babylonian Empire, the most powerful nation of its time. He walked in arrogance, believing he was the master of his own destiny. But God humbled him, stripping him of his throne, his power, and his sanity. For 7 years he lived like an animal, until he acknowledged that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. When God decides to humble the proud, there is no escaping His judgment. And when He chooses to exalt the humble, no one can prevent their rise. The Roman Empire, with all its strength, could not stop the spread of the gospel. The authorities arrested Peter and John, commanded them to stop preaching, and tried to silence the message of Christ. But when God is behind something, it cannot be silenced. The apostles kept preaching, miracles kept happening, and the church kept growing. Every attempt to suppress God's work only made it spread further. Even when they crucified Jesus, thinking they had won, they only fulfilled God's greater plan. The power of Rome, the authority of Caesar, and the schemes of the religious leaders could not stop the resurrection. And it is the same today. Governments may pass laws against faith, leaders may try to remove God from society, and systems may attempt to suppress the truth. But no legislation, no decree, no movement can erase the presence of God. Persecution has never stopped His church. In fact, it has only strengthened it. Dictators have tried to eradicate faith, but they have failed. Nations that once outlawed Christianity now have underground churches growing by the thousands. Every attempt to push God out only leads to His greater display of power. On a personal level, no authority figure can block the destiny God has for you. People may try to hold you back, institutions may attempt to deny you opportunities, and enemies may conspire against you, but they cannot override God's plan. If He has called you to something, no one can take it away. If He has opened a door, no one can shut it. The promotion, the breakthrough, the purpose He has for you, no boss, no leader, no system can stop it. The world may try, but they do not have the final say. Only God does. When God decides to act, no ruler can overrule Him, no government can control Him, and no earthly power can stop Him. He reigns above all, and His will shall always prevail. There comes a time when God says, enough. A time when He draws a line in the sand, when He steps in to shift the course of history, when He moves in power to bring justice, correction, and redemption. He is patient, merciful, and long-suffering, but He is also a God of righteousness. He allows wickedness to continue for a season, but He does not allow it to reign forever. When the weight of injustice reaches its limit, when sin reaches its appointed time, when the cries of the oppressed have filled the heavens, God moves. And when He moves, no force can resist Him. Look at the days of Noah. The world had given itself over to corruption. Wickedness filled the earth. Violence was everywhere, and people had turned their backs on their Creator. God had been patient, calling them to repentance, giving them time to turn back. But when the appointed time came, He stepped in. The rain began to fall, the floodwaters rose, and judgment swept over the earth. But Noah and his family, the ones who walked in righteousness, were saved. God's intervention was both judgment and deliverance. He wiped out evil, but He also preserved His remnant. Consider the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Their sins had reached the heavens, their wickedness had grown beyond measure, and yet God, in His mercy, was still willing to spare them for the sake of a few righteous people. But when none were found except for Lot and his family, judgment came. Fire and brimstone rained down, and the cities were no more. But even in judgment, God made a way for the righteous to escape. He pulled Lot and his family out, showing that while He deals with sin, He also preserves those who walk with Him. Look at Egypt. For 400 years, the Israelites suffered under slavery, crying out to God for deliverance. Pharaoh, in his arrogance, believed he was untouchable. He hardened his heart against God's warnings. He defied the commands of the Most High. But there came a moment when God said, enough. The plagues came, each one intensifying, each one shaking Egypt to its core. And when the final judgment fell, when the firstborn sons of Egypt perished, Pharaoh could resist no longer. The Israelites were set free, and the empire that once enslaved them was left in ruins. When God decides to act, no power can stand against Him. And it is the same today. The world is filled with corruption, with injustice, with leaders who mock God and trample on His ways. It may seem as though wickedness is winning, as though evil has the upper hand. But there is always a tipping point. There is always a moment when God says, enough. When He moves, when He steps in, everything shifts. Systems collapse, rulers are dethroned, and what once seemed unstoppable crumbles in an instant. This applies not just to nations, but to individual lives. There are people who have been oppressed for years, bound by chains of addiction, suffering under the weight of injustice, trapped in cycles of pain. They have cried out, waited, wondered if God was listening. And then, suddenly, He steps in. The chains break, the doors open, the enemy is defeated. There is a moment when the prayers that have risen for years reach their fulfillment. When the battles fought in secret are won in the open. When the darkness that seems so powerful is overtaken by light. God does not ignore injustice. He does not overlook the cries of His people. When the time is right, He moves. And when He does, no one can stop Him. When God moves, everything changes. What seemed impossible suddenly becomes reality. What was once broken is restored. What was lost is recovered. When God steps into a situation, He does not leave things the same. He transforms them. His presence disrupts the plans of the enemy, overturns the schemes of the wicked, and breathes life into places that seemed beyond hope. Look at the story of Joseph. He was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and falsely accused. He spent years in prison for a crime he did not commit. By all human reasoning, his life was over. There was no way out, no sign that things would change. But God was working behind the scenes. At the appointed time, He stepped in. In a single moment, Joseph was lifted from the prison to the palace, from the lowest place to the highest position in Egypt. What men meant for evil, God turned for good. The suffering was not wasted, it was preparation. The trials were not the end, they were the pathway to something greater. When God moves, the natural order is overturned. Time and time again, we see Him step into hopeless situations and bring miraculous turnarounds. The Israelites stood before the walls of Jericho, a fortified city that seemed impossible to conquer. But when God gave the command, those walls came crashing down. Gideon faced an enemy far greater than his small army could handle. But when God intervened, victory was won without even lifting a sword. When Jesus stood at the tomb of Lazarus, a man who had been dead for 4 days, He spoke a word, and life returned. The natural laws of death and decay were no match for the supernatural power of God. No situation is beyond His reach. No condition is too broken. No heart is too hardened. No battle is too far gone for Him to step in and change everything. The woman with the issue of blood had suffered for 12 years, spent all she had on doctors, and was left with no hope. But one encounter with Jesus, one touch of His garment, and in an instant she was healed. The man at the pool of Bethesda had been paralyzed for 38 years, waiting, hoping, believing that one day he might be healed. Then Jesus came, and with a single command, everything changed. This is the nature of God. When He moves, He does not bring partial deliverance. He brings complete transformation. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, and the broken are made whole. He does not just lift people up, He changes their destiny. He does not just open doors, He creates new pathways. He does not just restore what was lost, He multiplies what was taken. This is true not only in individual lives, but in families, communities, and even nations. When God moves, revival breaks out, entire regions are changed, the presence of God sweeps through, and what once seemed spiritually barren is filled with life. Hearts that were hardened against Him are softened. Those who were lost are found. The darkness that once ruled is pushed back by the overwhelming power of His light. And it happens suddenly. God does not need years to change a situation. He can do it in a moment. One decree from heaven, one word from His mouth, and everything shifts. The sickness that seemed permanent is healed. The financial struggle that appeared hopeless is turned around. The relationship that was broken is restored. The child that was lost returns home. When God moves, no one can stop it. No enemy can reverse it. No opposition can stand against it. He does not just intervene, He transforms. He does not just touch a life, He revolutionizes it. And when He decides that the time is now, nothing can stay the same. Everything changes. When God moves, the enemy trembles. The powers of darkness shake because they know that they cannot stand against Him. They can plot, they can resist, they can try to delay, but they cannot stop what God has ordained. Every scheme, every attack, every stronghold of the enemy is destined to fall when God steps in. The forces of darkness are real, but they are not equal to God. The battle has already been decided and victory belongs to the Lord. Look at the story of Pharaoh and the Israelites. For years, Pharaoh held them in bondage, using his power to oppress them. He thought he was in control. He thought he had authority over their lives. But when God moved, Pharaoh's grip was broken. Every plague was not just a sign, it was a direct assault on the gods of Egypt, proving that their power was nothing compared to the one true God. And when the final moment came, Pharaoh had no choice but to let them go. He tried to pursue them, thinking he could reclaim what he had lost, but God had already determined the outcome. The Red Sea parted for God's people, but it swallowed their enemies. The enemy always tries to fight against the plans of God, but he cannot win. Look at the story of Haman in the book of Esther. He devised a wicked plot to destroy the Jewish people. He manipulated the king, built gallows, and set everything in motion for their destruction. It seemed as though nothing could stop him. But what Haman did not realize was that God had already positioned Esther in the palace for such a time as this. The same gallows that Haman built for his enemies became the instrument of his own downfall. The enemy's plan was reversed, and instead of destruction, the Jewish people were saved. This is the pattern throughout history. The enemy schemes, but God overrules. The enemy tries to destroy, but God turns it for good. The enemy sets traps, but he falls into his own pit. No matter how great the opposition, no matter how fierce the attack, when God moves, the enemy's plans crumble. Look at Jesus. Satan thought he had won. He entered Judas, stirred up the religious leaders, and set the crucifixion in motion. As Jesus hung on the cross, it seemed like all hope was lost. The enemy believed he had defeated the Son of God, but he did not understand that the cross was not the end, it was the beginning. The very thing that the enemy meant for destruction became the greatest victory in history. On the third day, Jesus rose, and with his resurrection, he sealed the enemy's defeat forever. This is true in our lives as well. The enemy may come against you. He may try to stop your purpose, discourage you, or make you believe that there is no way out. But he does not have the final say. God does. And when God decides to move, no attack of the enemy can prevail. Every stronghold must come down. Every lie must be exposed. Every weapon formed against you must fail. The enemy may try to delay your breakthrough, but he cannot deny it. He may try to block your path, but when God opens a door, no one can shut it. He may try to silence you, but when God gives you a voice, no force can mute it. Every battle you have faced, every attack you have endured, is not a sign of defeat. It is proof that the enemy knows what God is about to do in your life. The enemy fights the hardest when he knows he is losing, but his time is up. His schemes are failing. His strongholds are breaking. Because when God moves, the enemy's power is shattered, and nothing can stop the victory that is coming. When God moves, his glory is revealed for all to see. His power is not hidden in the shadows, nor does he work in secret. When he acts, it is undeniable. The world may try to explain it away, the enemy may attempt to resist, and people may doubt. But when God steps in, the evidence of his presence cannot be ignored. His movement is not subtle. It shakes the heavens and the earth. Look at the parting of the Red Sea. The Israelites stood trapped between Pharaoh's army and an impassable body of water. There was no way forward and no way back. From a human perspective, it was an impossible situation. But God was about to move. And when he did not just open a small path or create a hidden escape route. He split the sea in two. He made a way where there was no way, and he did it in a way that no one could deny. The Israelites walked through on dry ground, and when the Egyptians pursued, the waters came crashing down. It was not just deliverance, it was a demonstration of God's unmatched power. God does not simply work behind the scenes. He reveals his glory in a way that causes people to take notice. When Elijah stood on Mount Carmel, he faced an entire nation that had turned to false gods. The prophets of Baal cried out to their idol, begged for fire, cut themselves, and exhausted every effort to prove that their God was real. But there was no answer. Then Elijah prayed a simple prayer, and fire fell from heaven. Heaven said, the altar was consumed, the sacrifice burned up, and the people fell on their faces, declaring, "The Lord, He is God." It was not just an answer to prayer. It was a revelation of God's supremacy. When Jesus performed miracles, He did not do them in secret. He opened blind eyes, made the lame walk, cleansed lepers, and raised the dead. Crowds followed Him, witnessing the power of God at work. Even those who opposed Him could not deny what they had seen. When Lazarus was raised from the dead, the religious leaders did not question whether the miracle had happened. They simply tried to stop the spread of the news. The power of God was so evident that they feared what would happen if people kept talking about it. This is the nature of God's movement. When He steps in, His work is unmistakable. It is not confined to private moments. It impacts entire communities. When revival breaks out, it is not hidden inside a single church. It spreads across cities and nations. When He moves in your life, the change is so evident that people take notice. God does not just bless, He blesses in a way that causes people to wonder. He does not just restore, He restores beyond what was lost. He does not just open doors, He opens them so wide that no one can claim it was mere coincidence. When He lifts you up, it is in a way that makes it clear it was His hand at work. When He moves in such a way that no one can take the credit but Him. This is why the enemy tries so hard to stop God's movement. He knows that when God acts, it brings undeniable glory. He knows that when God answers prayers, it silences doubt. He knows that when God delivers, it becomes a testimony that spreads beyond the person who received it. But the enemy cannot stop what God has ordained. He may try to delay it, distract from it, or distort the truth, but in the end, the evidence of God's power will shine through. When God moves, people who doubted begin to believe. Those who mocked begin to fall silent. Those who opposed Him are forced to acknowledge that there is no power greater than His. He does not simply work in quiet ways. He reveals His majesty for all to see. His name is glorified, His power is displayed, and His presence is made known. And when He does it, no one can deny that it was Him. God is about to step in, and no one can stop it. No power of darkness, no opposition, no scheme of the enemy can stand against what He has ordained. When He moves, He brings justice, deliverance, and transformation. He breaks chains, opens doors, and turns impossibilities into reality. He lifts up the righteous, humbles the proud, and silences the voices that defy Him. He is not a distant observer. He is the sovereign ruler, actively shaping history, moving in the lives of His people, and revealing His glory. The time of waiting is coming to an end. The prayers that have been lifted for years are about to be answered. The battles that have been fought in secret will be won in the open. What the enemy meant for evil, God will turn for good. What seemed lost will be restored. What was broken will be made whole. His power will be seen, His justice will prevail, and His presence will be undeniable. When God moves, everything changes, and when He decides to act, no force in heaven or on earth can stop what He is about to do.